The entire restaurant stopped breathing. Federico Greco, the retired don who'd built half of Chicago's underworld, had just violated the one sacred rule. You don't touch the help. He thought she was fragile. He thought she was powerless. He was catastrophically wrong. Instead of cowering, Maria Puglisi straightened her spine and delivered a slap so thunderous it echoed off the marble walls like a gunshot. The old man staggered backward, shock painted across his weathered face. But it wasn't the strike that froze the room. It was what came after. As Antonio Greco, the current boss and Federico's son, rose from his chair like a tidal wave of violence, his hand already reaching for the gun beneath his tailored jacket, Maria locked eyes with him. No fear. No regret. She leaned forward and whispered a single word in a dialect so ancient, like so forbidden, that it hadn't been spoken in these halls for 3 generations. Malakan. Rotten flesh. Infected blood. The ultimate accusation. Antonio's hand froze mid-draw. The color drained from the faces of the old-timers who understood. In that crystallized moment of silence, everyone in La Gemma realized the same terrible truth. This wasn't just a waitress. She was a reckoning from a past they'd tried to bury, carrying a truth that would either save them all or burn the Greco Empire to ash. And outside, in the gathering darkness, the Serpent Cartel was already moving into position. La Gemma didn't look like a fortress. That was the point. From the street, it appeared as just another overpriced Italian restaurant in Chicago's Gold Coast. All floor-to-ceiling windows, Edison bulbs hanging like captured stars, and enough exposed brick to satisfy every food blogger's Instagram aesthetic. But Maria knew better. She'd spent 3 months learning every secret the building held. The windows were 2 inches of ballistic glass. The exposed brick concealed steel reinforcement plates. The elegant wine cellar had a second door that opened onto an armory. Even the marble floors were chosen for a reason. They didn't absorb blood easily. La Gemma was where Chicago's underworld came to conduct business in the illusion of civilization. Deals were made over ossobuco. Territories were divided alongside tiramisu. And everyone pretended they were just successful businessmen enjoying fine dining, not predators temporarily sheathing their claws. Maria moved through the dining room like smoke, her steps silent, her presence easily forgotten. She'd perfected the art of invisibility over these long months. The slight hunch of her shoulders, the downcast eyes, the apologetic smile that made powerful men look right through her. They saw the uniform, not the woman. They saw the apron, not the arsenal of rage barely contained beneath it. At the center table sat Federico Greco, holding court like an emperor in exile. Retirement hadn't dimmed his appetite for cruelty, it had merely refined it. Without an empire to terrorize, he'd turned his venom on smaller targets. Waitstaff, valets, anyone who couldn't fight back. "You call this a Barolo?" Federico's voice carried across the restaurant, deliberately loud. He held the wine glass like evidence of a crime, swirling it with theatrical disgust. "This is piss, and my grandfather wouldn't have washed his feet in this." The sommelier, a rail-thin man named Marcus, who had a daughter in college, went pale. Maria watched from the kitchen doorway as Marcus stammered an apology, offering to bring something else. Anything else. Federico let him grovel for exactly 30 seconds before waving him away like an insect. "See that, Antonio?" Federico turned to his son with a professor's condescension. "This is why the old ways matter. Respect isn't given anymore. It has to be beaten into people." Antonio Greco sat at his father's right hand, a study in controlled violence, wearing a $15,000 suit. Where Federico was all theatrical cruelty, Antonio was a closed fist. He didn't need to raise his voice. The tattoos crawling up his neck from beneath his collar told you everything about where he'd come from. The Patek Philippe on his wrist told you where he'd arrived, and the bodies buried in concrete across 3 states told you the cost of that journey. The old ways built everything we have, Antonio said, his voice carrying the unshakable certainty of a true believer. He'd spent his entire life trying to earn his father's pride, and that desperation had calcified into doctrine. Whatever Federico said was gospel. Whatever Federico did was justified. Maria refilled water glasses at the adjacent table, her hand steady, her breathing controlled. She'd waited years for this moment, not the explosion, but the watching, the seeing. She needed Antonio to understand what his father truly was before the truth detonated in his face. Otherwise, but he'd die defending a monster, never knowing he'd wasted his loyalty on rotting flesh. Around them, the restaurant hummed with dangerous prosperity. At table 6, a city councilman laughed too loudly at a joke from a man who owned half the waste management contracts in Illinois. At table 9, 2 men in identical Navy suits discussed logistics in the bland euphemisms of murder. Near the bar, a woman in a dress that cost more than Maria's childhood home sipped champagne, while her husband negotiated the distribution of prescription opioids disguised as a real estate deal. This was La Gemma's real purpose, not food, but theater. A stage where criminals could pretend they were legitimate, where blood money could be laundered through the ritual of fine dining, where everyone agreed to the collective delusion that they were civilized. De Federico snapped his fingers at Maria without looking at her. You, the shy one, another bottle, and this time try not to bring me swill. Maria approached with her head bowed, her steps careful, her entire posture screaming submission. Inside she was counting the exits, counting the minutes, counting the men in the room who would need to die when the truth finally came. Yes, sir, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Federico didn't even glance at her. She was furniture, a servant, beneath notice. Perfect. Maria returned to the kitchen, her reflection catching in the polished steel of the pass-through window. For just a moment, she let her mask slip. The woman who stared back wasn't fragile at all. She was a blade waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It happened during the dessert course. It was when Federico's wine count had reached the dangerous territory between grandiose and unhinged. Maria was clearing the appetizer plates from table 4 when she heard the crash. Federico had swept his arm across the table, sending a perfectly plated panna cotta sliding onto the floor where it exploded into cream and shattered porcelain. The elderly Don was standing now, swaying slightly, his face flushed with alcohol and something darker. "This is what I'm talking about," Federico announced to the room, as if he'd orchestrated the mess to prove a philosophical point. No standards anymore. No pride. Just mediocrity served on expensive plates. Maria moved toward the disaster with a cleaning cloth, keeping her eyes down, her movements efficient. She'd cleaned up worse. She'd survived worse. Just a little longer, she told herself. Just wait for the right moment. But Federico had other plans. His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist as she bent to collect the broken porcelain. His grip was iron-strong despite his age, the fingers of a man who'd strangled his first victim at 19 and never forgotten the satisfaction of it. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," he hissed, yanking her upward. The restaurant's ambient noise, silverware on china, murmured conversations, the acoustic playlist bleeding through hidden speakers, died instantly. Maria felt 30 pairs of eyes lock onto her. Antonio's chair scraped against marble as he turned to watch. "You think you can just ignore me?" Federico's breath reeked of Barolo and decay. You think because you're some fragile little—" He never finished the sentence. Maria's free hand came up in a perfect arc, her open palm connecting with Federico's cheek with a sound like a wooden door slamming in an empty cathedral. The force of it wasn't just physical, it was metaphysical, a violation of natural law. In La Gemma, you didn't touch the Grecos. You especially didn't touch the patriarch who'd built the empire. But Maria had just rewritten the rules of reality. Federico stumbled backward, releasing her wrist, his hand flying to his face, where a crimson handprint was already blooming across his papery skin. His eyes were wide with shock, his mouth working soundlessly, his brain struggling to process an event that shouldn't exist in his universe. The restaurant had stopped breathing entirely. Antonio Greco rose from his chair like a force of nature, achieving sentience. 6'3" of concentrated violence, moving with the terrible grace of an apex predator. His hand disappeared inside his jacket, fingers closing around the grip of the Beretta he kept in a custom shoulder holster, the one that had ended 9 lives in the past 14 months. Maria didn't run, didn't flinch, didn't apologize. She turned to face Antonio directly, and for the first time since she'd started working at La Gemma, she let him actually see her. Not the meek waitress, not the invisible servant, the real woman beneath the carefully constructed disguise. Their eyes locked. Antonio's hand froze halfway to drawing his weapon, something in her gaze triggering an ancient instinct that bypassed conscious thought. This wasn't prey behavior. This was something else, entirely. Maria took one step toward him, not away, or toward, closing the distance between them until she could smell his cologne and see the confusion flickering beneath his rage. Then she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the silent restaurant, and spoke a single word in a dialect so old that Antonio had only heard it once before, from his grandmother in her final days. Malakan. The word hung in the air like a curse materialized into sound. Rotten flesh, infected blood. The ancient accusation used by the old guard to identify a traitor within one's own bloodline, a cancer growing at the heart of the family tree. Antonio's face went ashen. His hand fell away from his gun completely, hanging useless at his side. Around the room, the handful of men old enough to remember the old ways felt their blood turn to ice water. But that word wasn't thrown around casually. It wasn't an insult. It was a diagnosis, a declaration of diseased lineage. Maria held Antonio's stare, watching the confusion play across his features. He knew the word. He knew what it meant. But he didn't understand why this waitress, this nobody, would dare speak it in reference to his family. "What did you say?" Antonio's voice was barely audible, stripped of its usual command. Behind him, Federico had found his voice again, high and strained with indignation. "Antonio, kill this bitch. Kill her right now." But Antonio wasn't listening to his father anymore. He was staring at Maria, really seeing her for the first time, watching the pieces of a puzzle he didn't know existed begin to shift into a picture he wasn't ready to see. Maria tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Ask him," she said quietly, nodding toward Federico. "Ask him what he did to the Puglisi family in 1997. The name detonated in the room like a grenade. The panic button wasn't visible to customers. It was embedded beneath the host stand, disguised as a decorative nail head in the reclaimed wood. Marcus, the sommelier, had watched the entire confrontation unfold with mounting horror, and the moment Maria spoke the Puglisi name, his survival instincts overrode his fear of the Grecos. His hand slammed down on the button. The transformation of La Gemma was instantaneous and absolute. steel shutters dropped from hidden compartments above the windows with a mechanical shriek, slamming into reinforced floor slots with the finality of a tomb ceiling. The elegant Edison bulbs cut out, or replaced by harsh red emergency lighting that turned the restaurant into something from a submarine's interior. The front door's magnetic locks engaged with a metallic thunk that echoed like a judge's gavel. They were sealed in. For exactly 3 seconds, the only sound was the hydraulic hiss of the security system, completing its lockdown sequence. Then, Antonio's hand went back to his gun, this time completing the draw, the Beretta clearing leather and tracking toward Maria's center mass. "What the fuck did you just—" The front windows exploded inward. Except they didn't shatter, the ballistic glass held. But the impact was apocalyptic. Heavy machine gun fire raked across the steel shutters and reinforced windows. The sound like the world ending in real time. The .50 caliber rounds hammered the building's face in a sustained burst that seemed to last forever, but was probably only 5 seconds. The restaurant erupted into chaos. Diners hit the floor. Chairs toppled. A woman screamed. The city councilman crawled under his table, his expensive suit jacket thrown over his head, as if Italian wool could stop bullets. Antonio dropped into a combat crouch, his gun swinging toward the front entrance, his entire body shifting from rage at Maria to tactical assessment in a heartbeat. This was what he'd been trained for. This was what he was built for. "Serpents," he growled, recognizing the sound of the M2 Browning they favored for shock and awe attacks. "They're hitting us! Here! Now!" He was already moving, his voice cutting through the panic with the authority of a man who'd survived 3 gang wars. "Everyone on the floor, away from the windows, kitchen, now!" His crew materialized from among the diners, 4 men who'd been positioned throughout the restaurant disguised as customers. They moved with practiced efficiency, weapons appearing from ankle holsters and concealed carry positions, forming a defensive perimeter around Antonio. Another burst of gunfire, this time accompanied by the distinctive crack of an RPG launcher. The building shuddered as the warhead impacted the reinforced front door, the explosion contained but devastating. The door held, but buckled inward 6 inches. Smoke began filtering through the gaps. Federico had crawled behind the overturned center table, his earlier bravado replaced with the wild-eyed panic of a man remembering he was mortal. "Antonio, get me out of here! There has to be a back way!" But Antonio wasn't looking at his father. He was looking at Maria. She hadn't moved. While everyone else had hit the floor or scrambled for cover, she stood exactly where she'd been, the red emergency lighting painting her in shades of blood and shadow. Her expression was perfectly calm. Not shocked, not afraid. She'd been expecting this. "This is a turf war," Antonio said, his voice hard with certainty. "The serpents are making their move. They're trying to decapitate our operation in one strike." His tactical mind was already racing through scenarios, calculating odds, planning the defense. "We hold them off until our reinforcements arrive. 40 minutes, maybe less." "No," Maria said quietly. The single word cut through the chaos like a scalpel. Antonio's eyes narrowed. "What? This isn't a turf war." Maria took a step toward him, her voice steady despite the continued gunfire rattling the shutters. "They're not here for territory, Antonio. They're here for an execution." Outside, the shooting stopped. The sudden silence was somehow worse than the noise. In the brief respite, they could hear voices shouting in Spanish, the sound of vehicles repositioning, the metallic click of fresh ammunition belts being loaded. "They're regrouping," one of Antonio's men said. "Setting up for a breach." Federico's voice rose from behind the table, shrill and desperate. "Antonio, listen to me. This is just business, just territorial." "They know." Maria's eyes never left Antonio's face. Do they know your father sold them out? Gave the FBI everything. Names, routes, safe houses. 3 months ago, Federico made a deal to save himself, and now the serpents are here to collect the debt. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Antonio's gun hand wavered slightly, the barrel drifting between Maria and his father. That's a lie. Is it? Maria tilted her head toward the front of the building. How did they know you'd all be here tonight? How did they know exactly when to hit? How did they know about the security system and come prepared with heavy weapons? Federico was shaking his head frantically. She's lying. She's one of them. She triggered this. The building shuddered as another RPG round found its mark. If you are still listening, I would love to know where you are watching from in the comments, and kindly drop a like and subscribe if you have not. Thank you. Let's continue. Antonio's hand closed around Maria's bicep like a vice, hauling her backward through the swinging kitchen doors while his crew held the defensive line in the dining room. The kitchen was all stainless steel and harsh fluorescent lighting. No romance here, just the brutal machinery of commercial food preparation. He slammed her against the walk-in freezer door hard enough to rattle her teeth, the Beretta's muzzle pressed against her temple with enough force to leave a circular impression in her skin. "Start talking," Antonio said, his voice stripped down to pure threat. "You've got 30 seconds to explain why I shouldn't paint this freezer with your brain matter." Behind them, Federico stumbled through the kitchen doors, supported by one of Antonio's men. The old Don's face was still flushed, but fear had replaced the wine flush with something more primal. "Don't listen to her, Antonio. She's playing you. This is classic divide and conquer. Shut up." Antonio didn't take his eyes off Maria. "You. Talk." Now. Maria met his gaze without flinching, even with the gun pressed against her skull. When she spoke, her voice was eerily calm, the tone of someone delivering a medical diagnosis rather than fighting for her life. 3 months ago, your father was picked up by the FBI at a hotel in Evanston. Not arrested, picked up. There's a difference. She paused as another explosion rocked the building, plaster dust drifting down from the ceiling tiles. They had enough to put him away for life. Racketeering, or conspiracy, 3 murders they could prove, but they offered him a deal. "Lies," Federico spat. "Antonio, The deal was immunity in exchange for information on the Serpent Cartel's Chicago operations." Maria continued as if Federico hadn't spoken. "He gave them everything. Warehouse locations, distribution networks, the names of every Serpent lieutenant operating north of Roosevelt Road. 47 arrests followed. 47. Antonio's jaw clenched, but the gun didn't waver. Why would the feds let the Serpents know where the intel came from? They didn't have to. Maria's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Your father isn't as smart as he thinks he is. He used his personal phone to set up 2 of the meetings with his handler. The Serpents have people inside the telecom companies. As they pulled the records, they saw the calls to known FBI numbers." Federico pushed forward, his voice rising. "This is insane. Antonio, I'm your father. Would I betray—" "Show him your phone," Maria said quietly. The kitchen went silent, except for the distant sound of gunfire and men shouting tactical positions in the dining room. "What?" Federico's face went pale. "Your phone," Maria repeated. "The burner you keep in your left jacket pocket. The one you've checked 17 times tonight. Show your son what's on it." Antonio's free hand shot out, grabbing his father's jacket and reaching into the pocket before Federico could react. The old man tried to twist away, but Antonio was faster, stronger, and now very, very interested in what required such protection. The phone was a cheap, prepaid model, or the kind you bought at gas stations and threw away after a week. Antonio thumbed it open, his eyes scanning the limited call history. His face transformed, not into rage, but into something worse. Comprehension. The collapse of a worldview. "These are FBI numbers," Antonio said, his voice hollow. "Jesus Christ, these are FBI numbers." "Antonio, listen to me." Federico's hands were up now, placating, desperate. "I had to. You don't understand. They had evidence, real evidence. I was looking at life. I was protecting us, protecting the family. You gave them the serpents to save yourself." Antonio's voice was dead. "And now the serpents are here to return the favor." "It was supposed to be clean!" Federico's composure shattered completely. "I gave them the serpents. They were supposed to take them down. And we'd expand into their territory. It was strategy, Antonio. It was business. You didn't tell me." The gun pressed harder against Maria's temple, but Antonio was looking at his father now. "You made a deal with the FBI, and you didn't tell me." Maria spoke carefully, aware that she was standing between a man with a gun and his unraveling reality. "He didn't tell you because he knew you'd never approve. You still believe in the code, honor among thieves, the old ways your father loves to lecture people about." She paused. "He was going to let you take the fall if it went wrong." "That's not," Federico started. "There's a second deal," Maria interrupted. "Check the texts." Antonio scrolled down. His breathing became shallow. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "You gave them me." The kitchen door burst open. But one of Antonio's crew, a scarred enforcer named Dante, stuck his head in, his face urgent. "Boss, they're bringing up a battering ram. We've got maybe 5 minutes before they breach the front door. We need you out here." Antonio didn't move. The gun was still pressed against Maria's head, but his eyes were locked on his father, watching the old man's face cycle through denial, justification, and finally, naked fear. "The texts," Antonio said softly. "They're time-stamped from today. You contacted your FBI handler this afternoon. You told them where I'd be tonight." His voice cracked. "You were trading me for witness protection." Federico's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Outside, the battering ram struck the front door with a boom that shook the entire building. The battering ram hit again, but this time the reinforced front door gave way with a tortured shriek of metal. The sound of boots hitting marble echoed through the building. Not a few men, but many. The serpents weren't probing anymore. They were flooding in. Antonio's gun finally lowered from Maria's temple, not because he'd decided to trust her, but because the immediate threat had shifted from mystery to mathematics. He could hear at least a dozen hostiles in the dining room. His 4-man crew wouldn't hold for long. "Boss!" Dante's voice carried from the dining room, punctuated by gunfire. "We need you now." Antonio moved toward the kitchen doors, but Maria's hand shot out and caught his wrist. The grip was iron-strong, trained, nothing like the delicate touch of a waitress who'd spent 3 months serving wine. "You go through those doors with just guns. Well, you'll last 90 seconds, she said. "Let me show you what this kitchen really is." Antonio stared at her, his mind still reeling from his father's betrayal, trying to process why this woman was helping him instead of letting the serpents finish the job. "Who the fuck are you?" Maria pulled off her apron in one smooth motion, then reached up and yanked out the pins holding her hair in a submissive bun. Dark waves fell around her shoulders, transforming her appearance from downtrodden servant to something else entirely. When she spoke, her voice had shed all pretense of meekness. "My name is Maria Puglisi. My father was Don Giacomo Puglisi." She nodded toward Federico, who had slumped against the prep counter, broken and irrelevant. "The man your father betrayed in 1997. The man whose empire your father stole, or the man who died in federal prison because of testimony your father provided to save his own skin. The pieces clicked into place in Antonio's mind with sickening clarity. You've been waiting for 28 years. Maria moved to the industrial stove, her hands flying over controls with practiced precision. I was 7 when they took my father. I've spent my entire life learning how to survive, how to fight, and how to kill men like the ones coming through that door. She cranked the fryer oil to maximum heat. Your father took everything from my family. But you? She glanced at him. You're just his weapon. And right now, we have the same enemy. Gunfire erupted from the dining room, automatic weapons, close quarters, the sound of men dying. Dante appeared in the doorway, blood streaming from a gash above his eye. Boss, they're through. We can't. The first serpent crashed through the kitchen doors behind him, an MS-13 enforcer with a MAC-10 and enough tattoos to tell his entire criminal history. He raised the weapon toward Antonio. Maria moved. She grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the range and hurled it like a discus. 22 pounds of French craftsmanship caught the serpent in the face, shattering his nose and sending him stumbling backward into the doorframe. Before he could recover, Maria had crossed the distance, a 10-inch chef's knife appearing in her hand from a magnetic strip on the wall. The blade found the gap between his 3rd and 4th ribs with surgical precision. She was already moving to the next threat before the first body hit the floor. 2 more serpents came through the doors. Maria hit a switch on the wall and the overhead chemical wash system activated. Industrial degreaser, meant for end-of-night cleaning, now spraying directly into the intruders' faces at high pressure. They screamed, clawing at their eyes. Maria didn't give them time to recover. A second knife, a brutal boning blade, found the first man's throat. The second tried to fire blind, his bullets punching through stainless steel and shattering glass, but Maria had already dropped below his line of fire. Antonio watched, stunned, as this woman who'd served him wine transformed into something from a nightmare. She fought with the efficiency of someone who'd studied violence like a doctoral thesis. No wasted movement, no hesitation, every action serving a purpose. She rolled to the fryer, grabbed the handles with towels wrapped around her hands, and heaved. 350 degrees of cooking oil arced through the air like napalm, catching a 3rd serpent who'd made the mistake of following his companions. His screams were inhuman. "The kitchen is a weapon," Maria said, breathing hard but controlled, knife still in hand. "You just have to know how to use it." She pointed to the shelves. Pressurized cleaning chemicals, improvised acid attacks, liquid nitrogen for flash freezing, throw it in their faces. The meat locker has CO2 canisters that can displace oxygen in an enclosed space. More boots in the dining room, more shouting. The serpents were regrouping, realizing the kitchen breach had gone catastrophically wrong. Antonio made a decision. He turned to Dante and his remaining crew. "Fall back to the kitchen. We're making our stand here." Maria was already moving to the next defensive position, her eyes calculating angles and weapons with the cold precision of a battlefield engineer. "The walk-in cooler," she said. "We can funnel them through a single entrance, killbox formation." "You said you've been waiting 28 years, Antonio said, taking position beside her, his Beretta trained on the doors. "Why help me now?" Maria checked the edge on her knife and gave him a look that contained decades of pain compressed into a single moment. "Because dead men can't see their fathers for what they really are," she said, "and I need you alive to understand what yours cost us both." The kitchen had become an abattoir. Antonio fought from behind the stainless steel prep counter, his Beretta barking in controlled pairs. 2 shots. Assess. 2 more. Center mass. Professional. The training his father had paid for with blood money. Coming back to save his life, from the consequences of his father's treachery. Beside him, Maria moved like violence, choreographed by a sadistic god. She'd abandoned the knives for a fire axe pulled from the emergency equipment locker, wielding it with the brutal efficiency of someone who understood that elegance was a luxury they couldn't afford. A serpent came through the doors, and she buried the blade in his shoulder, using his collapsing weight as a shield against the gunfire from his companions. Dante was down, clutching a stomach wound, but still firing, his blood mixing with fryer oil on the tile floor. The other two crew members had created a crossfire position, using the industrial ovens as cover, were turning the kitchen entrance into a fatal funnel. But they were losing. For every serpent they dropped, two more appeared. The cartel had come prepared for war, and they had the numbers to wage it. Antonio's magazine ran dry, and he dropped behind cover to reload, his hands moving through the muscle memory, while his mind raced through increasingly desperate scenarios. That's when he noticed his father. Federico had retreated to the corner near the dry storage entrance, supposedly taking cover from the firefight. But he wasn't cowering. He was watching. His eyes kept flicking to the service exit, the one that led to the alley, the one that bypassed the main security lockdown because it was designed as a fire escape. And his hand kept going to his pocket. Not the pocket where Antonio had found the FBI phone. A different pocket. Antonio's next magazine clicked home, but he didn't immediately return to the fight. He watched his father with the same tactical assessment he'd use on an enemy position. Federico pulled out a phone, another burner, how many did he have, and began typing with his thumbs, his face illuminated by the screen's glow. Maria appeared at Antonio's shoulder, breathing hard, arterial spray across her white shirt, turning it into abstract art. She'd seen it too. "He's texting someone," she said quietly, barely audible over the gunfire. "During an active firefight, your father is texting someone." A serpent made it 3 steps into the kitchen before Dante put 2 rounds in his chest. The body fell across the threshold, creating an obstacle that would slow the next wave by precious seconds. But those seconds were running out. They all were. "What, Antonio?" Federico's voice cut through the chaos, high and strained. "We need to retreat. The service exit. We can fall back. Regroup." Antonio didn't respond. He was watching Federico's face, really watching it for the first time since the siege began. The old man's eyes were too bright, his movements too calculated. This wasn't panic. This was performance. Maria ejected her empty pistol magazine. She'd taken a gun from one of the fallen serpents and slammed home a fresh one. "He's not scared enough," she observed. "A normal person, trapped in a siege? They'd be paralyzed or hysterical. Your father is neither." She was right. Federico was worried, certainly. But it was the worry of a man concerned his plan might fail, not the terror of a man facing certain death. The service exit door rattled slightly. Not from the battle, but from someone testing it from outside. Antonio's blood turned to ice water. The serpents were hitting them from the front with overwhelming force, pinning them down, making them desperate. And Federico kept glancing at the back door, kept texting, kept suggesting they retreat toward it. "It's a pincer," Antonio said, the realization spreading through him like poison. "They're not just trying to breach, they're herding us." Maria nodded grimly. "He told them about the service exit. He's supposed to lead you to it. They'll be waiting." Another burst of gunfire. One of Antonio's crew, a kid named Marco, who'd just made his bones last year, took a round in the throat and went down, his arterial spray painting the ceiling in crimson Rorschach patterns. They were down to 3 functional fighters, Antonio, Maria, and Dante, who was using the prep counter to stay upright, his face going grey from blood loss. Federico's voice again, more urgent. "Antonio! For God's sake, we have to move. The back way. It's our only chance." But Antonio was remembering Maria's word. Malacan, rotten flesh, the cancer in the bloodline. He'd spent his entire life defending this man, believing in him, enforcing his will with violence. How many people had Antonio hurt because his father commanded it? How many lives had he destroyed in service of a lie? The phone in Federico's hand buzzed with an incoming message. The old man's face flickered through an expression Antonio had never seen before, relief mixed with something like anticipation. "Boss," Dante gasped through gritted teeth. "We're almost out of ammo. Whatever we're doing, we need to do it now." Antonio looked at Maria, or she looked back, her dark eyes offering no comfort, no easy answers, just the truth. His father had brought death to this door, and now death was collecting. The ammunition situation had gone from critical to catastrophic. Antonio's Beretta locked back on an empty chamber for the third time, and when he reached for his last magazine, his fingers found only 2 rounds rattling loose in his jacket pocket. Across the kitchen, Dante had stopped firing entirely. He was slumped against the base of the prep counter, his breathing shallow and wet, the stomach wound having taken its inevitable toll. The kid, Marco, was already cold, his eyes staring at nothing. It was just Antonio and Maria now, and the serpents knew it. The assault had shifted from overwhelming force to patient pressure. They'd stopped rushing the kitchen and started firing in controlled bursts, keeping their targets pinned while they maneuvered for better positions. Professional, tactical. They knew time was on their side. Maria had pulled back to the walk-in cooler entrance, using the reinforced door frame as cover. Her stolen pistol was empty, discarded. She'd retrieved her fire axe and what looked like a commercial-grade meat cleaver. Medieval weapons for a medieval situation. "We need to move," she said, her voice steady, despite the impossibility of their position. "The main hall. If we can get back to the dining room, we can use the overturned tables for cover. Create a better defensive position." Antonio knew it was a desperate play. The corridor between the kitchen and dining room was a fatal funnel, 20 feet of exposure with no cover. But staying here meant dying here, and he'd never been the type to wait for death to arrive on its own schedule. "On 3, he said, chambering one of his 2 remaining rounds. "We move fast. Stay low." That's when he realized his father was gone. The corner where Federico had been crouching was empty. In the chaos of the last exchange of gunfire, while Antonio had been focused on not dying, the old man had vanished. Maria saw it on his face. "Where?" The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed from the back of the kitchen, the service exit. Someone was manipulating the lock from inside. Maria's eyes went wide. "No." She moved before Antonio could process what was happening, sprinting toward the rear of the kitchen with her axe raised. Antonio followed, his remaining round ready, his mind finally accepting what his heart had been denying. His father was opening the door. They found Federico in the service corridor, his hands working the heavy-duty deadbolt that secured the exit. The old man's face was slick with sweat, his movements frantic. He'd managed to disengage the first lock and was reaching for the second when Maria's shout stopped him. "Step away from the door!" Federico spun, and for a moment, just a moment, Antonio saw his father's true face. Not the patriarch, not the builder of empires, just a frightened old man willing to sacrifice anything, anyone, to save his own skin. "Antonio," Federico said, his voice taking on the commanding tone he'd used throughout Antonio's childhood. "Put the gun down. You don't understand. I've made arrangements to trade me," Antonio said flatly. "That's what the texts were about. That's why they're hitting the front so hard. You told them you'd deliver me through the back door." Federico's hands came up in a placating gesture. "It's not like that. I negotiated safe passage for both of us. They need a gesture of good faith. They need me dead, Antonio corrected. Because I'm the one who actually runs the organization. I'm the one who knows where the real money is, where the operations are. You've been retired for 5 years. You're not valuable anymore. His voice was eerily calm. I am. And you're giving them me to save yourself. From the kitchen, they could hear the serpents regrouping, preparing for another push. Time was measured in seconds now. Maria kept her axe trained on Federico, but her eyes flicked to Antonio. But he's been texting them our position this whole time. Every defensive position we've taken, every time we've moved. He's been feeding them intelligence. Federico's face contorted with desperation. You sanctimonious bitch! You think you're better than me? Your father would have done the same thing. Survival is all that matters. Survival is the only law. My father died with honor, Maria said quietly. In a prison cell, betrayed by you. But he died with his soul intact. Can you say the same? The second lock clicked open under Federico's earlier manipulation. The old man's hand shot out toward the door handle, making his final choice. Antonio's last bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him away from the door. Federico hit the wall with a cry of pain and shock, clutching his wound, staring at his son with uncomprehending betrayal. You shot me, Federico gasped. Your own father. You killed me first, Antonio said. You just wanted me to die after you were safely away. Outside the service exit, they could hear movement, voices in Spanish. The serpents were already in position, waiting for the door to open, waiting for the old man to deliver his son like a sacrifice to appease the gods of survival. Maria moved to the door and quietly, carefully, re-engaged both locks. Antonio stared at his father slumped against the wall, blood seeping through Federico's fingers where they clutched his wounded shoulder. The old man's eyes were wild, bouncing between his son and the relocked door, his mind trying to calculate an escape route that no longer existed. Antonio, please. Federico's voice had shed all pretense of authority. This was begging, pure and unadorned. I'm your father. Blood is blood. You can't just... Blood is blood, Antonio repeated, his voice hollow. He looked down at the Beretta in his hand, the chamber empty, the weapon now just an expensive piece of metal and polymer. That's what you always taught me. Family above everything. Loyalty above all. The old ways. From the kitchen, the sound of boots on tile. The serpents were pushing forward again, sensing weakness, smelling blood in the water. Maria grabbed Antonio's arm, her grip urgent. We need to move. Now. There's a safe room off the wine cellar. Reinforced walls, separate ventilation. We can hold there until... Until what? Antonio's laugh was bitter. Until the police arrive and arrest everyone. Until your vendetta is complete. But he was already moving, because staying meant dying, and some instinct deeper than thought still demanded survival. Federico struggled to his feet, using the wall for support. Take me with you. Antonio, I'm hurt. I can't. You can't leave me here. Antonio stopped, turned, really looked at his father for what felt like the first time in his life. Not the mythic figure who'd built an empire from blood and fear. Not the teacher who'd passed down the sacred codes of honor and respect. Just an old man who'd spent decades preaching loyalty while preparing to violate it the moment his own survival was threatened. Do you know what Malacan really means? Antonio asked quietly. Federico blinked, confused by the question while gunfire echoed closer. It means traitor, or rotten flesh. No. Maria spoke from the doorway to the wine cellar, one hand on the hidden switch that would reveal the safe room. It means something more specific. It's what the old guard called someone who carried disease in their bloodline. not metaphorical disease. Actual genetic corruption that would poison every generation that came after. She looked at Antonio with something that might have been pity. Your grandmother used to say it about your father. Before she died. Before he silenced her. The words hung in the air like smoke. Antonio remembered his grandmother's final years, how she'd grown increasingly hostile toward Federico, how she'd tried to tell him something during her last visit to the hospital. But his father had interrupted, sent him away, and when he'd returned, she was sedated. She died the next day. She knew, Antonio said. She knew what you were. Federico pushed off the wall, stumbling toward his son. Antonio, listen to me. Everything I did to survive, to keep us alive. You think the game has rules? You think there's honor in dying? I built everything you have. You built it on betrayal. Antonio's voice was flat. The Puglisi territory you took in '97. You didn't win it in a war. You gave them to the feds and picked up the pieces. Strategic thinking. The Delgado brothers in 2003. You blamed them for a hit they didn't order, let me kill them, and took their smuggling routes. They were competition, the Castellano partnership last year. You advised me against it. Said they couldn't be trusted. Antonio's eyes were dead. But it wasn't about trust. It was because they'd figured out what you were, what you've always been. Federico's face cycled through emotions, anger, fear, desperation, before settling on a terrible calculation. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. No more pleading. This was the voice of a man playing his final card. You need me, Federico said. I'm the only one who knows where all the bodies are buried, literally. I'm the only one who can tell you which cops are bought, which judges are ours, which FBI agents take our money. You kill me, you lose all of that. Antonio felt something break inside him. Not dramatically, not violently, just a quiet snap, like a rope finally giving way after years of strain. I'm not going to kill you, he said. Relief flooded Federico's face. Thank God, thank Maria, open the safe room. The wall panel beside the wine cellar slid open with a hydraulic hiss, so revealing a reinforced steel door behind it. Maria disappeared inside. Antonio followed. Antonio! Federico lurched forward. Antonio, wait! Antonio stopped at the threshold and looked back. His father was silhouetted against the corridor, backlit by emergency lighting, the sound of the serpent's advance growing louder behind him. You taught me that actions have consequences, Antonio said. That in our world, debts must be paid. You sold the Puglisis, you sold the serpents, you tried to sell me. He paused. Now pay your debt. You can't leave me out here. They'll kill me. I know. Antonio stepped through the door. Maria was already at the control panel, her finger hovering over the lock mechanism. She looked at Antonio, giving him one last chance to change his mind. He nodded. The steel door began to close with mechanical precision. Through the narrowing gap, Antonio watched his father's face transform from disbelief to understanding to pure animal terror. Federico threw himself at the closing door, his wounded shoulder forgotten, screaming his son's name. The door sealed with a definitive thunk. Outside, they heard Federico's fists hammering against the steel, his voice muffled, but still audible. Antonio! Antonio! Please! I'm your father! Then, louder. The serpents reaching the wine cellar corridor. Then, gunfire. Then, silence. Antonio stood facing the sealed door, his reflection staring back at him from its polished surface. He looked like his father, the same jaw, the same eyes, the same blood. Malakan! Maria stood beside him in the cramped safe room, saying nothing, giving him space to process patricide by abandonment. "How long can we stay in here?" Antonio asked, his voice mechanical. 72 hours, maybe more." "Will the police come?" "Eventually." Silent alarm went to 3 different stations. Antonio nodded slowly. His father had stopped screaming. He wondered if that meant it was over, or if Federico had simply run out of air to scream with. "I should feel something," he said. Maria's hand found his shoulder. "You will. Later, when the shock wears off." "What do I feel then?" She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried 28 years of experience. "Relief," she said, and then guilt about the relief. And then, if you're lucky, something like peace. Outside the safe room, the serpents ransacked La Gemma, looking for survivors, looking for answers, looking for the man who'd betrayed them. They would find Federico first. The sirens came with the dawn. Antonio heard them through the safe room's ventilation system, first distant, then multiplying, then surrounding the building in a chorus of authority that meant the siege was finally over. The serpents would scatter like roaches when the lights came on. They always did. Whatever they'd come for, they hadn't found it. Or maybe they had. Maria checked the external cameras, grainy feeds showing the dining room, the kitchen, the wine cellar corridor. Bodies everywhere, overturned tables, bullet holes in the walls like punctuation marks in a story written in violence. The restaurant that had been a temple to criminal civility was now a crime scene that would take forensics teams weeks to process. "Coast is clear," Maria said, her hand on the door release. "Police are securing the perimeter. We should..." "Wait." Antonio's voice was raw from hours of silence. "My father." Maria pulled up the wine cellar camera. The image was poor quality, the emergency lighting casting everything in shades of red and black. But it was clear enough. Federico Greco lay crumpled at the base of the wine cellar stairs, his body twisted at an angle that suggested the fall hadn't been the worst of what happened to him. The blood pooling beneath him was black in the camera's rendering, spreading across the concrete like spilled wine. Antonio stared at the screen for a long time. He waited for grief, for regret, for something that would confirm he was still human beneath the scar tissue of this life. But all he felt was a vast, echoing emptiness, like a building after everyone has left, and you can finally hear the structure itself breathing. "Is he?" Antonio couldn't finish the question. Maria zoomed the camera. "His chest is moving, barely. The serpents left him alive." She paused. "The police will find him. Paramedics will take him to county. If he survives, he'll talk. He always talks. The FBI will protect him. Witness protection. A deal." "Yes." Antonio nodded slowly. So his father would live after all, in some suburb under some fake name, spending his remaining years watching game shows and remembering when he was a king. It seemed appropriate somehow. Federico had always been more afraid of death than capable of accepting it with dignity. "He'll never be able to come back," Antonio said. "To Chicago, to the life." "No," Maria agreed. "He's already gone. I'm just his body that needs to catch up." She opened the safe room door. The air that rushed in smelled of cordite and blood, and the particular scent of a place where too many people had died too quickly. Antonio followed her out into the wreckage of La Gemma, his shoes crunching on broken glass, his eyes taking in the cost of his father's final betrayal. Dante had died at some point during the night. Marco too, of course. The serpents had left 8 bodies of their own, men who'd never see their families again, because an old man couldn't accept that his time was over. Antonio climbed the stairs to the dining room. Morning light was streaming through the bullet holes in the steel shutters, creating shafts of illumination that caught the dust and smoke still lingering in the air. The police were at the front door now, shouting commands, preparing to breach. He looked around for Maria to tell her, "What?" "Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for showing me the truth. Thank you for forcing me to see that the man I'd built my entire identity around was hollow at the core." But she was already moving toward the back of the restaurant, away from the police, away from the questions and the arrests and the unraveling that would follow. She'd retrieved her apron from somewhere, the one she'd worn as a waitress, the disguise she'd maintained for 3 months while waiting for this exact moment. It was folded neatly on the bar counter, placed with the same precision she'd used to set tables. "Maria." Antonio's voice stopped her at the kitchen entrance. "Wait." She turned, and in the morning light streaming through the bullet holes, he could finally see her clearly. Not the waitress, not the warrior. Just a woman who'd spent 28 years carrying the weight of her father's legacy, who'd learned to kill and fight and survive, all for this moment of truth. "You saved my life," Antonio said. "You could have let them take me. Let the serpents finish what my father started. Why didn't you?" Maria smiled, but it was sad and tired and carried no triumph. "Because I needed you to see him. Really see him. If you'd died defending him, believing in him, that would have been his final victory. He would have died a king in your eyes." She adjusted the apron on the counter, smoothing a wrinkle that didn't exist. "But now you know. Now everyone will know. Your father doesn't get to be remembered as a builder of empires. He gets remembered as Malakan. Rotten flesh. That's what you wanted? Or just the truth?" "That's all I ever wanted." The police were through the front door now, shouting orders, weapons drawn, flashlights cutting through the haze. Antonio heard his name being called, heard the commands to get on the ground, to show his hands. He looked back to the kitchen, but Maria was already gone. Just an apron on the counter and the faint sound of the service exit closing, the same door his father had tried to open, now serving as her escape route. Antonio raised his hands slowly as the police surrounded him. He would survive this. His lawyers would earn their retainers. The empire his father built on betrayal would need a new foundation, one not constructed from rot and lies. He was the undisputed king now. The throne was his. It had never felt more empty. The truth always has a price in a world built on loyalty. The greatest betrayal comes from those we trust most. Maria Puglisi spent 28 years preparing for one moment, not revenge, but revelation. Because sometimes the cruelest punishment isn't death, but forcing someone to see the truth they've been denying their entire life. Federico Greco built an empire on betrayal and died a coward. Antonio Greco inherited that empire but lost his father. And Maria? She walked away with nothing but the truth. And sometimes that's everything. The real power isn't in the crown you wear, but in the illusions you're willing to shatter. If this story made you question everything you thought you knew, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales where nothing is as it seems, and the truth is always worth the cost.